Started here. So good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Getz. If we haven't met before, I'm the Vice President of Economic Development and Strategic Communications here at the Greater Manchester Chamber. Thanks everyone so much for joining us this morning for our economic forecast. We hope today's program will assist you in connecting your businesses to the latest economic trends and the forecast locally, statewide, nationally, and globally. So our goal here for you all today is to leave this program better positioned to make key business decisions in the year ahead. I'm just going to start with a few housekeeping notes. As just a reminder, if everyone could stay muted during the presentations, but I encourage you all to engage with each other in the chat. We aim to incorporate all of your questions and have received some leading up to the program, but please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as they rise throughout the presentation, and we'll make sure that we get to those during the Q&A session.
Check.
If enabling speaker mode will be the best format to view this presentation in, because our economist will be going through a PowerPoint presentation. So you can enter that mode by navigating to the top right of your screen and selecting speaker mode versus the whole gallery view. And then let's see. And yes, this program is being recorded and we'll make that available to you as a resource on YouTube after the event. But before we get started, I do want to recognize some members of the Greater Manchester Chamber Board that are joining us here this morning. And our board members are just a group of highly engaged and community-driven individuals who have championed the Chamber's success and progress over the years. So we're really thrilled to have some of them represented today. A lot of them were at our State of the City with our new mayor, Jay Rouet, yesterday. So thank you to our board members for your support. Brian Bicknell from Manchester Community College, Trini Houghton from Ripple Effect Studio, Jody Nizaka from the Manchester Economic Development Office, Ted Kitchens from the Manchester Boston Regional Airport, and Holly Horst from the Manchester Young Professionals and the Manchester Police Athletic League. Thank you guys for joining us this morning. I also want to take a moment to recognize our advocate sponsor of today's economic forecast, TD Bank. Joe Bader from TD Bank is joining us today for our economic forecast. And TD Bank is really committed to supporting programs like this to promote economic progress within the business community here in Greater Manchester. So thank you, Joe and TD Bank, for your sponsorship. And then we'll just get right to it. I want to introduce our speaker for today's economic forecast. Some of you may have heard from him before, and I'm very excited to share as well that Brian Gottlob, our economist today, will be doing an in-person forecast this fall at our Economic Growth Conference. So save the date for that. It's Access 2024 is September 24th. 2024, where we will kick off that conference, which is a new event that the Chamber started last year with an in-person economic forecast. Today, a little more about Brian. He's the director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau, and he's going to share his economic update for the remainder or for the course of 2024 and his insights on key issues and challenges facing our local and state and regional economy. Brian was appointed director of the Labor Market Information Bureau, and prior to that was the principal of Pull Econ Research, which is an economic consulting firm located in Dover. Brian has completed studies on a wide range of economic, demographic, energy, financial, fiscal, and labor market issues in New Hampshire and many other states. So thank you so much for being here with us this morning, Brian, to share your breadth of knowledge. I know we'll hear a little bit more about housing in today's presentation, which kind of is like a great continuation of what Mayor Rouet was sharing with us yesterday at our State of the City. So Brian, I will welcome you to the virtual stage and let you take over.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I'll start sharing my screen here, if that's okay. Here we go. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. We're good? All right. First, I want to thank the Chamber for I'm not sure why, but invited me back again, and I have to say, I think maybe it's because I was sort of right on my forecast at this time last year. So I call this a part of my victory tour. At this time last year, most economists were suggesting or saying that the U.S. economy would be in recession, and for those of you who are unfortunate enough to be at that presentation I did last year, you'll see that I did not believe the nation was going to fall into recession, and maybe more importantly, my forecast said that Manchester area would see faster job growth than either the U.S. or New Hampshire overall in 2023, and I'm happy to say that I was also right about that. Although I did under forecast job growth by about 1/2, but I'm happy to be under forecasting the strength of the economy rather than over forecasting. So with that, I'll start giving kind of an overview and outlook. And I do want to say I'm going to cover key trends in the national economy. I'll talk about trends in the state economy, and I'll highlight it's hard for me to say that highlight a lot of the good things that are happening in Manchester, because I do believe there's just a lot of good news in the Manchester region. I will highlight, as Lauren mentioned, some housing issues, which I think are one of the bigger challenges that the region and the state face, and introduce what I think is a key metric to kind of highlight some of the challenges that the Manchester faces in the housing issue. So my overview, very much like it was at this time last year. Although I think the outlook and the risks of recession have declined significantly. I think over the past several months, we've seen economic data look much better than many people had expected. That GDP growth was stronger. Labor market, while slowing, is still very resilient. Inflation, last couple of months seems a little bit stubborn. A lot of that has to do with housing and how it's calculated, but it is falling, and I expect it will continue to. Credit conditions, which were of concern earlier in the year because of some issues with some banks, I have highlighted that that's not been a problem in New Hampshire, but it did cause some easing or some tightening of credit. That's easing, and that's very good for the economy. One of the things that I think astounds me, continues to astound me, is how confidence has remained unrealistically soft. Although in the last month or two, we have seen consumer sentiment looking a little bit better, and more importantly, consumers have been spending, regardless of how they say they feel about the economy. There's not an indication that they have significantly cut back on spending. Both the U.S. and the national labor market are strong. Manchester labor market's strong. It's solid, but it's slowing, not slowing to problematic levels, and I'll highlight some of that. The big issue, big issue here, is that I should learn how to spell Manchester, but the Manchester and New Hampshire labor force remain below pre-pandemic levels, and that's the biggest problem I think that we're facing right now in terms of limiting our job growth in the state and in the region. But this is exactly the scenario I said last year, that without large job losses, and I will show you that we have not seen large job losses, and without large job losses, then you don't see a big decline in income. And if you don't have a big decline in income, consumer spending remains resilient. And in that scenario, it's almost impossible to have a recession nationally. Again, job growth will be slower in 2024, but I think as inflation slows, and while this is getting a little bit more questionable, I had thought a mid-year interest rate cut would be in the cards because of declining inflation. That's been a little bit more stubborn, so maybe that'll be pushed off to the second half of the year. I think households will become more confident in 2024. I mentioned that the sentiment and confidence among businesses and individuals has been surprisingly soft. This is my two measures that I always show. I follow the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. That's the blue line. That had been lower than it was during the worst of the pandemic. It has bounced up a little bit, and has been generally on an upward trend as inflation has slowed, and as wages have increased. Wages now are rising faster than inflation. That's a really good sign for spending and for households. Some things remain stubborn. Food prices are remaining stubbornly high, as are housing prices. The other one is that I follow is the Small Business Optimism Index, and that's not really moving in the right direction. And I suggest that the reason that is I think small businesses have really suffered the most under current conditions of labor shortages and higher labor and material costs. They have more difficulty absorbing the wage increases, absorbing the material costs, and I think that's contributed greatly to the sort of Main Street businesses feeling less optimistic. I don't know who remembers the misery index. Haven't been talked about a whole lot, and I guess that's because we haven't had a whole lot of misery. But I thought I'd bring it out again. The misery index, for those of you who don't recall it, or maybe who were too young to ever experience the real misery that was part of the early 1980s. When inflation was very high and unemployment was very high. That's what the misery index does. It's basically a measure of, overall economic conditions, a very simple measure that adds the rate of inflation plus the unemployment rate nationally. And when that number is very high, well, people generally don't feel very good. And those shaded areas there are periods of recession, and generally, the misery index is higher during those periods. What is interesting is if you look at the far right, which is the most recent monthly data, 3.1% inflation, 3.7% unemployment rate. That's a pretty good situation. The economy is in a good spot. 6.8, not the best we've seen over the last 20 years, but pretty darn good. And yet, if I go back, you'll see the consumer sentiment index is still relatively low. By my calculations, using this historical data, it should be up around 90. It's right around 70 right now. So, for whatever reason, individuals do not seem to be responding to the economic conditions, at least in the sentiment index, although they do continue to spend. Those of you, again, who follow my previous presentations, this was a metric that I looked at starting during the pandemic when I wanted information on a daily or weekly basis. Most government data, economic data, comes out on a monthly basis with a lag. Google searches on the term recession tend to be highly correlated with difficult economic times. This chart shows it. The blue line is the US search intensity on the term recession. And New Hampshire is the red line. Look on the left side of the graph, you see at the beginning of the pandemic and early in the pandemic, people were very concerned about a recession. It dropped off as the pandemic eased. It rose sharply again when Russia invaded Ukraine. Oil prices spiked, gasoline went to $5 a gallon, and inflation really seriously accelerated. It has come down, and by this metric anyway, people do not seem to be overly concerned with recession, even though they're indicating they're not particularly positive about the economy. Good news on the inflation front, it's bounced around a little bit the last several months. I attribute a lot of that to how house prices and housing costs, including rental, which is really the prime driver of this, are calculated. Rents are only, rental contracts, roll over or are renewed on an annual basis. So it takes time for any changes in rental costs to be reflected in the CPI. And that's, I think, keeping inflation from falling further. But I do expect it'll be much closer to 2% by the end of this year. And that will be very good news for a lot of businesses and certainly for consumers. Just looking at where, a lot of concern lately about household debt levels and how much credit is being acquired, and credit card debt has risen fairly significantly, mostly among younger or among lower income households. This is two metrics that I like to look at. And it's lagged Q3 2023, so it's 6 months lagged almost. But it just shows the burden that households are facing. One, household debt as a percentage of disposable personal income. It's really low by historical standards if you look at the last 40 years. So even in a weaker economic conditions, households overall, with the caveat again that it really depends on income levels. Lower income households are clearly struggling more. The other measure, the blue line, is household financial obligations as a percentage of disposable personal income. That's higher. That includes things not only as mortgage debt, but also rental payments, insurance payments, things of that nature. And it is also much lower than it has been historically. So I think households overall, with the caveat that these are aggregate figures, lower income households have struggled more and are struggling more. A lot of concerns about delinquencies and what's happening with the higher acquisition of debt, what's happening with credit card debt or auto loans. And this just is a measure that looks at the total delinquency rate on household debt, and that includes all forms of debt. And what you see most recent month, January of 2024, household delinquency on debt is still much lower than, just taking a look at the 5 years prior to the pandemic. So again, another metric that shows households are in pretty good shape, whether or not they indicate that they feel very good about the economy based on the Consumer Sentiment Index. This is just different rates of delinquency. I won't spend a lot of time. The two top ones where there are highest rates of delinquency also tend to be the ones most used by lower income households. Again, with that caveat. With student loan debt, not much in terms of delinquency, but that's one because there's a lot of forbearance programs. In addition, the administration, federal administration, has forbidden any holders of that debt or servicers of that debt from reporting delinquencies to credit agencies. So that's kind of a false metric. Again, whatever consumers are saying about the economy, they are spending, and this is real inflation adjusted consumer expenditures, which includes not just retail. People are spending a little bit less on retail, more on services, more on traveling, medical services, all those things that they couldn't do during or as easily during the pandemic and shortly after. So spending is really, really solid. And again, when you see this kind of spending above the rate of inflation, then it's really hard to see a significant downturn in the economy as long as that continues. Taking a look at employment now in New Hampshire, where we stand, this is a measure that looks at private sector employment and compares where we are as of December of 2023 compared to where we were at the peak of private sector employment prior to the pandemic. Peak employment in New Hampshire prior to the pandemic was February of 2020. Each state here, it looks at where they are in comparison to that peak. New Hampshire, again, as in a lot of metrics, better than its New England neighbors, better than all states, with the northeastern states, with the exception of New Jersey. I don't believe New Jersey has a better economy than New Hampshire, but they did benefit from the pandemic in that all those people, or a lot of those people that were working in office buildings in New York City, they moved out. Even though the companies may still be headquartered in New Hampshire, the workers moved out to places like New Jersey, and that boosted employment in New Jersey significantly. The states on the far right are all states that didn't have really significant shutdowns, as significant as shutdowns as all the northeastern states, which took much more stringent measures to control the pandemic. The states on the far right are more open area, less constrained, less shutdowns on the pandemic. So let's take a look now at how Manchester and the Nashua NECTA. What's a NECTA? I always have to say this. NECTA is a New England city and town area. It's the kind of the equivalent of a metropolitan statistical area. It's a collection of communities that share economic connections, so commuting patterns, etc. So Manchester NECTA includes about 19 towns, Manchester and about 18 other towns around Manchester. This shows private sector job growth on a 3-month moving average compared to the prior year. And what you see generally, black line US, red line New Hampshire. In this chart, Manchester is the blue line and Nashua is the orange or yellow line. Generally a decline, a slowing rate. New Hampshire and the US still pretty strong, 1.7, 1.6. That's compared to the last 20 years, a good rate of employment growth, not quite as fast as coming out of the pandemic. But the astounding thing about this is what's happened in 2023 to Manchester, and that's reflected in the fact that New Hampshire or Manchester has about twice the rate in most recent months of the rate of private sector job growth year over year as New Hampshire and the US. So really solid job growth in 2023. I predicted higher job growth than New Hampshire and the US. I did not project forecast this high. I think when I looked back, I think I had projected 1.6 over the year for Manchester and about 1.1 for New Hampshire and a little bit higher for the US. So I'll claim victory on that one, although a little bit less of victory. Taking a look at just comparing one month over month again, looking at the kind of the major economic areas in the state, the Dover-Durham NECTA, which is basically Stratford County, the Portsmouth NECTA, Nashua. You see again how Manchester has really been the standout in terms of job growth. Just a lot of really exciting things from my perspective happening in Manchester. And having done this event or even a decade and a half ago during events, the last few years, it's been a real pleasure to be able to come here because so many positive things have been happening, I think, in the city. Looking at the trend, job openings rate is declining. I mean, the fact is that job growth is slowing. It's not slowing because there's a lot more people losing their jobs. It's slowing because, businesses have been a little bit more cautious about posting jobs, about hiring, and in some cases they've had difficulty hiring. But this opening rate is an indication that businesses have become a little bit more cautious in terms of posting jobs. Looking at again the Manchester region, again, this is the greater Manchester area. It's the same trend if you look at to the right. This is job postings on a monthly basis. It's a 3-month moving average because tend to get big spikes at certain months of the year. This smooths it out a little bit, but generally the same kind of trend. Coming out of the recession, the pandemic recession, a big increase in job openings. More recently, it has started to slump a little bit, but still high compared to pre-pandemic levels. So still really solid demand for labor in the Manchester region. I'm just looking at the industries. When I take a look at those job postings and which industries are looking to hire most, the thing that struck me is the number, and this is a little bit unique in this region, the number of postings from placement agencies and temporary health services. When I do this, and I have done a number of these forecasts around the state, and I look at each region, generally, it has been healthcare industries that have the highest. I think that's probably true in this region because of the concentration of healthcare industries. But I think part of the desperation that healthcare industries are facing, and all businesses are facing some difficulty in hiring, is that they're turning more to employment placement agencies and temporary help services in order to get their labor demand met, to satisfy the openings that they have. And that's why these agencies have grown as much. And I think there's probably more of them in the Manchester area than there is throughout the rest of the state. I mentioned that layoffs haven't been very high. I did hear not that long ago somebody speculating that layoffs were really rising largely because of the national news related to Facebook or Google or Meta, those companies that have and Amazon that have had some large scale layoffs. But my feeling of that is that those big tech companies really represent a very small portion of overall employment. And while this will sound very, very insensitive, when I think about those people and their layoffs, do you know how long they'll be without a job? For as long as they want to be. Their skills are in demand. They will easily and quickly be rehired by other organizations. So taking a look at what's happened in New Hampshire, this is a chart that compares how weekly claims for unemployment, people who are getting paid benefits on a weekly basis, compare in 2022 and 2023 to the exact same weeks in 2019. 2019 was a very good year for our labor market. So the fact that we are below and remain below where we were in a very good, very tight labor market in 2019, to me is an indication that we're really not, I don't have a lot of concerns about increasing layoffs. One, I said this last year, businesses are reluctant to lay people off because they know how difficult it will be to hire back if their economic conditions or economic outlook improves. Just comparing some other states and the nation, Massachusetts in particular, I always like to compare and contrast. Massachusetts has a pretty strong economy. In a lot of ways, our economies are very much intertwined, but their claims for unemployment are higher than they were during 2019, again, which was a good year. And the U.S. is about the same as it was. So by this measure, I'm really not concerned about layoffs in New Hampshire. They may rise. I do expect that they may rise a little bit, but we're not anywhere near danger based on some national headlines made by some big tech companies. Big issue that we are facing, not only in New Hampshire, but in Manchester, and a lot of the Northeast, looking more broadly, is the labor force growth. And I do have some problems with these numbers. I've battled with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics over their methods and how these numbers are calculated. They don't seem to listen to me, even though I theoretically work with them or for them in producing New Hampshire numbers. This shows that New Hampshire, by BLS metrics, has seen a decline in its labor force over the last year. I don't really think that's occurring. I don't think we're back to where we were, and that's problematic. If you have a smaller labor force than you did, prior to the pandemic, which now is, almost 4 years, then that's really going to limit your job growth. The fact that it indicates that we have declining labor force really contrasts, however, with the employment growth that we know that has occurred. So there's a lot of inconsistent numbers, and I've tried to make that point, but to deaf ears. The U.S. overall has seen, recovered its labor force. Manchester area, luckily, after seeing a greater dip, is actually now closer by this metric. These numbers will probably change, but I do think Manchester is performing better, and that's indicated again by the fact that employment growth in the region has been stronger. Big issue that we're facing with the labor force is our ability to accommodate more people into it, even if our labor force in New Hampshire traditionally has grown, when it's grown the fastest, by people moving into the state from other states. That has been true. Over the last 6-7 years, we've added, significant number of people who've moved here, particularly during the pandemic and immediately following. A lot of people looking to move out of more densely populated metro areas in the Northeast, looked, to come to northern New England. New Hampshire benefited greatly. Maine benefited, maybe even a little bit more. Vermont, which had seen net outmigration for 10 years, actually have seen increases in the last few years. But the challenge that we face now is that we can't accommodate a lot of people. And this is just one metric looking at Hillsborough active homes for sale in Hillsborough County. They're down by almost 70%. If we look at this nationally, you'll see the same pattern or almost every portion of the state. And not everybody who not everybody who's looking to move is looking to purchase. So I'm going to look a little bit at some of the rental statistics in a second. But I wanted to look at what's happening with prices in Hillsborough County. The green line is the median asking price per square foot. You see kind of a steady increase. We know the housing market has struggled, higher interest rates, lack of supply. One of the things that has not happened is that prices really haven't come down, at least in terms of price per square foot. I don't look at median prices, sales or asking prices, because that doesn't control for the size of the home. If you have different size homes or different types of housing, that can affect the asking price. What I do see pretty consistent increase. The red line is the median days on the market. And you can see a real seasonal pattern there, but I highlighted the same month of each of these years, December, which is the most recent data we have. So you see kind of a steady decline in median days on the market until 2022 and 2023. So that's begun a little bit of an uptick, and I think that's a result of the fact that interest rates rose so much that it did result in buyers either being priced out or or being hesitant because of higher interest rates. This is just an indication that all of that sounds like not particularly good news, but the fact is that the housing market in this region, despite the high costs, despite the fact that we've had higher appreciation than most states, median days on the market compared to the U.S. average, we're still 20% below Hillsborough County. And if I did this for New Hampshire overall, it's not that much different. It's a hotter, I know there's not a lot of sales going on, but when there is something that does come online or on the market, it is being gobbled up pretty quickly, and at rates that are significantly faster than the U.S. overall. We know the U.S. housing market has been hot. It's even hotter in this region. Again, indication of the demand. The fact that we have a strong economy, it's a good place to live. All of those things factor into it. This issue, I know the mayor talked about this, mayor-elect, no longer mayor-elect, now mayor, talked about some of the housing issues, and I did want to look quickly at some of the data there. And this just compares, I could do a longer time series, but I just took, 10-year difference in rental vacancy rates in Manchester. Manchester had pretty low vacancy rates in 2013. I did a presentation over in the Seacoast, in the Dover area. In 2013, the 1-bedroom vacancy rate was about 9%. The 2-bedroom was about 7%. So comparatively, Manchester's had much lower vacancy rates, even back 10 years. But now when you look at where they are right now, 2023, this is data from the Housing Finance Authority, you see just how extremely low the vacancy rate is. That's a real killer in terms of people looking to move into the city. It's particularly problematic when you're looking to attract a younger demographic, which I don't know many communities that aren't concerned about their demographics and how and how they're aging. So I mentioned my new metric. I was struggling to put into context how New Hampshire, Manchester, and other communities compare in their construction of multi-family housing, which is really the key to addressing the rental housing issue. So I looked at this measure, and I apologize. I live in Dover, so I know that community. I didn't want to highlight a lot of communities. I just picked Dover because I know it so well, and because it is kind of an extreme. I looked at housing units authorized by building permit in buildings with at least 5 units or more per 1,000 residents. And I took most recent data I had was 2023. So this 12-year, 13-year period, how many units were authorized per 1,000 residents during that time period. And what you see is Dover, my community, and I know this because I live there, lots of rental housing being built. It's had some really positive impacts on our demographics, attracting young people. New Hampshire, significantly lower, but Manchester even lower than New Hampshire. So I really think that speaks to one of the key issues in Manchester, and that's attracting people, young people. Manchester's a younger community overall, but attracting younger demographic, particularly when you see all of the exciting things that are happening in the economy of Manchester, and all the dynamic employment opportunities in the mill yard, et cetera, which tend to be in industries that have a younger demographic. So the ability to accommodate those people is really affected, I think, by this particular metric, which is rental units, particularly larger rental units with more units, because adding 2 to 4 unit buildings doesn't really go very far in addressing the shortage. So how does that metric that I just showed you translate into demographic changes? So I just looked at what happened to growth in population age 25 to 34 during the most recent census, in rental housing. I've said this in other presentations, and amenities are really a key to attracting and keeping a younger workforce. They like to be in places where there's lots of young people, other young people, for whatever mating rituals they engage in. And it's really important, to have rental housing available if you want to attract that demographic. So Dover had a much higher increase in population during that 10-year period, 25 to 34-year-olds. New Hampshire had lower increase, and Manchester even lower. Manchester's still young, but still, I think it highlights the prior chart and this one, the importance of building rental units in attracting that demographic. I'm going to quickly, this is just I won't spend much time on here. Just, communities age differently. Some communities are aging much faster. The yellow bars are the median age in these communities in 2010. The change in median age 2010 to 20. Manchester did really well. Manchester, that occurred, that slowing of the median age, largely because you have much higher birth rates. Dover's a little different. We don't have the higher birth rates, but we added a lot of younger people. Communities that didn't add many younger people or don't have many have a higher birth rates or many births age much more quickly. So if you're concerned about the demographics and the aging of the population, one way to do that is attract younger people, particularly people who may be having children at a later time. So I'm almost done here. My growth forecast for 2024. I put the probability of recession really low. And if you think about, recessions in this country, they generally, if you look at the last 40, 50 years, every 6 or 7 years, that would put the probability in any one year at about 15%. So I think it's just elevated a little bit. I do think growth will slow. I think unemployment will get closer to maybe even up to 4%. GDP growth will drop maybe a little bit below potential. And very possible that I'm under forecasting again, but again, I'd rather do that than over forecast. Looking at employment forecasts for the state, the nation, I do expect it to slow. Again, my forecast for the Manchester NECTA is about what it was last year. Last year I was 1.6. Again, I under forecast by half. I under forecast all of these by half, by the way. So I do think that there's significant potential upside there. There's also some potential downside risk. It will be a slower year, but those are still pretty positive numbers and no recession in sight. I do have one comment. We go through a process every year where we benchmark the estimates that are done on a monthly basis based on the payroll records that we get from companies who pay unemployment insurance taxes. We're in the process of doing that. And when that happens, sometimes the growth rates look a little different, and my forecast will get adjusted based on that. Lastly, you know, I did my victory tour. I'm almost done with it. I think this is the last presentation I'll be doing for a while. But as you know, positive as I am overall, it will be a slower year, but there's still a lot of risks to the outlook. I think those risks have diminished quite a bit. Last year, I was much more concerned about the Federal Reserve and what they were doing with interest rates. I do think, you know, they're in the mood to want to cut interest rates. I think that they've been cautious because of what has happened in the last few months with the inflation rate, and they look at it a little different. They don't look at the CPI, they look at the personal consumption expenditure, which is a different metric, but similar. Oil price spikes always are a concern. Anytime there's an oil price spike, people get very nervous, they cut back spending, and the risk of recession. Almost every recession over the last 50 years has had some oil price component to it. Middle East could, you know, produce a major conflict that could. One that I think is on the rise is that whole global supply chain disruption. We know what happens when global supply chains get disrupted during the pandemic. Prices shot up. You know, it was difficult to get materials. Prices shot up. And I'm increasingly concerned about that, although I still don't put a high probability on that. Government shutdown, you know, we keep pushing it off 4 or 6 weeks. But if it does happen and it happens for more than a couple of weeks, then it causes significant problems. And lastly, this one is dropped at the bottom. Credit conditions worsened significantly. You know, at the beginning, early last year, March, February, you know, there was concerns about the banking industry, deposits leaving. I had written, you know, showing that New Hampshire bank deposits really didn't decline and actually had increased during that time period. Nevertheless, there was concerns. Credit conditions did seem to tighten as banks got a little bit more wary of, you know, of making loans based on concerns about potential liquidity if they lose deposits. But anyway. With that, I will stop. I know I flew through these. I hope next year, if I'm asked back, maybe I'm only asked back when I'm right. If I'm wrong, you know, maybe I will decline the invitation. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Brian. And oh, you'll continue to be asked back. No worries. And if you're wrong, I mean, some things we just can't necessarily predict. So thank you for your time. We have 2 questions in the chat. I have one or two questions. I do want to touch on climate and energy very briefly too, but I'll save that for a minute. But definitely, it was interesting to hear your perspective on layoffs, and that it is primarily transferable skills. It's not really something I had thought so much about, and it is something you hear a lot about in the news lately. So that was just an interesting tidbit. When talking about the Great Migration and people moving here, and young people moving here, it sounds like amenities, housing inventory, obviously, as we discussed, and mobility are all things that are really important to young people moving to the area. One question I had for you, kind of in regard to infrastructure being an important piece of that, and fiber. It seems like the fiber optic network has been being built out a lot in New Hampshire and definitely here in Manchester. We do it at my house now. I'm very close to downtown, and it allows us to provide fast internet for our tenants, which I see as being important. So just kind of wondering how you're seeing that being an attractive thing for young professionals relocating.
Yeah, I do think, I think in the past I've shown my kind of one man's view of what helps attract young kind of millennials and younger folks. And I do think that whole digital, state-of-the-art digital connections are absolutely critical. I think Manchester's well poised in that. From a broader perspective of the state, I think it's one of the greatest opportunities that more rural communities face in New Hampshire. There's just the whole work-life balance, remote work has just shifted people's perceptions of, where they can work, where they need to work, we've separated work from where you live increasingly. So people are choosing places to live where they just want to live. And that just bodes really well for New Hampshire. It bodes well for a lot of, our some of the areas in New Hampshire that haven't benefited as much from from the positive economic outlook. Manchester is really well poised to attract a younger demographic if it gets, if it allows, affords people the places to live. Because it has kind of more of an exciting vibe all the time. Again, young people like to agglomerate where there's lots of other young people. They tend to like it in more urban areas, and yet you're close enough to, to recreational areas where that's not a problem. So I do think it's having a positive impact. I'm not fully realized yet, but it is one of the great really good opportunity for a lot of communities.
Great. And kind of another question that was shared with me, kind of on that aging statistic, and someone had said they recently heard that Hillsborough County was the only county in the state to be net positive in population growth with more births than deaths, and they're wondering if that is accurate.
Yeah, I think there's two now, and I'm not sure if it was Stratford or Rockingham. There's two last I looked. I mean, I have tracked that for many years. I haven't looked at the most recent year. At first it was 4 counties, then it's gone down to 2, 3, 2. Hillsborough, because it has 2 large metro areas, or medium-sized metro areas, the demographics of both Manchester and Nashua are more aligned with having higher birth rates. It's a less homogeneous population that has more of the demographics that are likely to have larger families or to have children. So the Manchester, Nashua are really the key contributors to that. So if it's not the only county, it is one of 2. Overall, New Hampshire over the last few years has dipped into that pool where there's more deaths than births, which makes that ability or to accommodate people moving into the state absolutely critical. It's been critical for decades. It's how we have grown, primarily people wanting to move into the state. So that's why housing, we talk about housing in terms of affordability, but just having housing to accommodate that movement into the state or into your community is absolutely critical. There's certain kinds of housing will affect the demographics, but just having housing in general available affects the size of the labor force. It affects the trends in demographics in the state.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's watching who didn't attend our State of the City yesterday, I can send out that recording where our new mayor in Manchester does talk about some plans he has for housing and how he's focusing on that being one of the larger issues our community is facing. Brian, how are businesses doing in New Hampshire overall? Are we seeing increases in businesses starting and moving to the state, or are more businesses leaving? What's that growth looking like? And what sectors are experiencing the most growth? Which, one is definitely biomanufacturing, but.
Sure. And actually, I had a chart on that didn't make the cut because I always start out with twice as many charts as I wind up presenting, because I just like to put together charts. But there's a couple of metrics that I look at. One is the people, companies that start up are required, if they have employees, are required to pay into the unemployment compensation system. And so they get an account with us. And based on those numbers, we've seen a pretty significant increase in the number of businesses that have started. There's other metrics that the Census Bureau reports, which is applications for employer identification numbers for the IRS. Those numbers are up. They're up in New Hampshire. They're up nationally. So I think that, you know, the number of businesses coming to New Hampshire or just starting in New Hampshire, a lot of it is just, you know, organic people who already live here starting businesses, people who maybe had worked in, you know, some companies now starting a spinoff, whatever. So that's positive. In terms of the industries, that hasn't changed a lot. I mean, you did mention one key aspect or highlight of the manufacturing sector. You know, manufacturing's done pretty well. In New Hampshire, we've actually seen some increases, and in particular, you know, that whole biofabrication, you know, medical devices is big. Life sciences, those industries have done really well, and we're looking to be, I think, a real center of innovation. Obviously, Army plays into that, but I think that is a real sweet spot. And I've always say this: New England has a history of being innovative in industries in the manufacturing sector, and then once things become very routine, they often leave to be done elsewhere. So the key to our growth is that innovation, the next big innovation, whether, you know, it was, you know, textile innovation, computers, mini computers, you know, biosciences, whatever, catching that next wave is critical. So, but when I look at the actual growth in employment, one industry, one set of industries that has really stood out, it has been professional, technical, and scientific services. We continue to add jobs in those, you know, that's architects, engineers. It could even, you know, could be marketing professionals. You know, it can be a whole host of different industries, even lawyers. And we continue to add those jobs during the pandemic. You know, the demand for healthcare services is going to continue to grow. The only thing that's keeping that from growing is the lack of labor. Because when you think about what will drive growth in different industries, one is, you know, demographics is playing into that. Older populations demand more healthcare. We have wealthier populations, so as population ages, more demand for healthcare services. So healthcare has been really solid. Some industries that have, you know, suffered a little bit have been hospitality industries, even, and I think that's more attributable to the difficulties they've had in finding labor, because clearly people are dining out and people are traveling again. That's been problematic. We saw a big increase in transportation and warehousing. I think that's starting to level off. Why would that have occurred? Well, pandemic accelerated, you know, the increase in online shopping relative to brick and mortar retail. So everybody was purchasing everything online. That means you got to have warehouses, and warehouses were being built in the Manchester area. Access to the airport, absolutely critical. And that often needs to be trucked to places. So we saw a big increase in that. It's starting to level off, but that trend, you know, is going to continue to be important. That has a negative impact, of course, on brick and mortar retailers. So I think it's fairly broad. You know, the big losers, from my perspective, have been hospitality industries, a lot of, to some degree, government, state government. Some industries have lost employment because of kind of, I think, the change in expectations of work-life balance made it a bit more difficult. Hospitality, not allowing remote work, makes it more problematic. Too long of an answer, but it's pretty broad based.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. The industries that are harder to transfer to
Yeah.
some sort of work-life balance or remote type of setup are going to struggle when they have employers who can offer that. Specifically to just kind of on the regenerative medicine industry, one question was just how employers in this industry can help develop the workforce necessary to sustain the projected growth. One example is there is like this new Elevate New Hampshire program it's a student loan repayment program for people in the regenerative manufacturing industry. So that's kind of one like really key example of how employers can make that industry more attractive for people to transition to. So just wondering if you have any more insight into other ways that growth can
No, I
be
mean, I think
propelled.
that's great. Obviously, that's, you know, student debt is important, and whatever you can do to make New Hampshire and this region more attractive, that's one of the ways. You know, I think that there's a real opportunity with partnering with education and training institutions. I think we're really fortunate that you know, I talk with community college presidents and the system on a pretty regular basis. Just did a presentation for their board, and they are absolutely eager. They always want to know what industries are going to be growing, how can we be relevant? And in a lot of ways, I see them as a key because they generally have more flexibility in developing programs. Not to say that the university system or other universities aren't important partners, but I think community colleges have a desire and more ability to be flexible in their offerings and can develop them more quickly. So I think that, and I'm sure it's happening. I'm not as familiar with what's happening, but the development with, you know, the Manchester Community College, even Nashua Community College, those institutions, you know, over on the Seacoast, Great Bay Community College developed a program specifically to train skills for Lonza Biologics. You know, they were one of the early life science companies that has continued to expand in the region. But I visited the lab where they train individuals who are going to be hired by Lonza Biologics. I think that will happen with you know, the life sciences industry that's emerging in the mill yard with Army and those different companies.
No, that's true. And I know that's what they're focused a lot on down in the mill yard right now is building those partnerships. But when any employer trying to figure out how to support that industry's growth, you know, start thinking of ways on how to partner is definitely one good path for growth there.
And I do think we need to let students know that there's going to be a lot of opportunities there because it's new.
Yeah.
They're not as familiar with it. They know certain industries, you know, for a while it was coding. Oh, if you could program and code, then that you were going to get a job. You know, we need to make young people aware of the opportunities in that industry.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point. Right before we wrap up, I know we're at time, but I just wanted to, this is another topic we could talk about for another hour, I'm sure. But some people may be hanging on for a question on this topic. So I recently read, I guess at the end of January, a New York Times article titled "We're All Climate Economists Now." And they were talking a lot about how economists have really started a different approach to talking about climate. And, you know, everyone's kind of figuring out incentives for clean energy production. You know, with climate change affecting everything from household finances to the electric grid, the profession seems to be increasingly focused on how society can mitigate carbon emissions and cope with the impacts. So just kind of, you know, we've got wind turbine manufacturing. That's, you know, a big thing that's being implemented, you know, even in New England, how like electric grid impacts. So really just, I know that's very broad, but kind of wanted to get a little more of your insight there on maybe how all of that is impacting people's choice to move to New Hampshire and live here, and the economy overall.
Yeah, you know, I don't think it's impacting right now. I think it will. You know, I think one of the ways New Hampshire has distinguished itself as, we have a pretty sophisticated workforce and a sophisticated economy. One of the things that we don't have a reputation for is really being on the forefront of that particular issue. We do have some renewable energy. I probably shouldn't share this. I was a part of a failed wind project many years ago. I did some work for the largest wind farm producer in the world, and we couldn't get a project permitted in New Hampshire. We see it in terms of the whole net metering issue, which has been a struggle to allow larger scale, solar projects, those kinds of things. So I don't think we have a particularly good reputation in that area. And I think, for younger generations, that's more important, I think, to think that we're on the right side of that. I don't think it's factored in very much in terms of people's economic decisions. They're seeing it indirectly. You're going to start seeing it in terms of insurance costs. They're already seeing it in certain places. Florida, because of the extreme weather, and California. So they're seeing insurance rates jump. We haven't really seen those kinds of things yet, but as they become more apparent, I think awareness, we're fighting whether or not there's climate change, and that's true around the nation. If we can't get beyond that and say yes, there is, we're never going to get to the point of what can we do in order to help mitigate that. And those things that you talked about, things related to renewable energy is critical. What policies? I don't know. If I say this, I know I'll get crucified. I've been in favor, like most economists, of a carbon tax. From my perspective, you either pay it now to avoid the much higher costs down the road. I know economists on all sides of ideology, some from very conservative ones to much more liberal ones, who all think that's one of the ways we can address. But if you don't believe climate change is occurring, you're never going to get to have the difficult battle of a carbon tax.
Well, thanks for that perspective, Brian. No, we appreciate it. And I know, all of that is something on a lot of business owners' minds. So at this point, I think we're going to wrap up. However, Brian and I both can hang on as people start to hop off. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop on your camera and just ask us any final questions or thoughts that you might have. So real quick, just thanks again to Brian. And thank you again to our advocate sponsor, TD Bank. Just to plug some upcoming events at the Chamber, we'd love to see some of you guys at. We do have a network at night next Thursday, February 22nd at the Dairyfield School. We also have our State of the State with Governor Sununu, which will be his last with us, at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics on March 7th. Of course, Taco Tour Manchester on May 2nd. So, that's a great economic boost to the greater Manchester area, and is something we would love all businesses to engage with us on and participate in. And then again, just save the date for August 24th for our Economic Growth Conference, where you will have an opportunity to hear from Brian again in person, and maybe what we can weigh then how much of what he said was true today. But no. So we would love to have you guys save the date for that. Thanks again, everyone. We'll send out the presentation and the recording as well for your reference throughout the rest of the year. So enjoy your, Thursday. Enjoy your weekend. I think it's a long weekend for some. Some of us will have Monday off. And I really appreciate your time this morning, everyone who joined us, and Brian as well. So thanks so much.